opportunities. Church might happen once a month when the preacher came around on his horse. The men had a trade society. There wasn't cash at that time, so they had a interaction through their trade. But when you look back and read these memoirs of women, or when they interviewed women of that time, some of them had stayed on the farm for 7 or 8 years without even leaving the farm. All they had was their family. And so there was a real sense of isolation as far as for women. And then you look at the women who started the guild, and they had a very different path to walk. The ones I'm going to talk about today. There was one male founder, Alan Eaton, and I'll talk about him first and get him out of the way. You've got to admire him. I mean, he was able, he was there, and they accepted him in their group. He was a representative from the state of Oregon before he went to work for the Russell Sage Foundation. And he was basically run out as suspicion of a communist from Oregon. And he went to the Russell Sage Foundation. I'm going to talk about that just briefly. That organization still is in existence. But their primary focus was social work, going into the cities and helping in factories with child labor. That was one of their great successes. And they also looked at the Southern Appalachians as an opportunity. So many different groups were trying to take advantage of this region for the coal, bringing in the railroad. All kinds of different people wanted a piece of the pie. And so many people at that time, when you're looking at that time in our history, had a consideration that if you weren't right in the mainstream culture, educated, living a certain way, well, perhaps you might be a little bit sub. And so the Russell Sage Foundation sent out people to find out exactly what was going on in these hollers. And when they came, they discovered that there was a culture here that was worth saving. And that's where these missionaries or social activists came in. And we'll start with Frances Goodrich, primarily because she was the first. She came in 1890 to Asheville area, East Asheville. And she was an independent social activist at that time. She had not hooked up into the Presbyterian home mission. And what she saw was, she had traveled. Let me tell you a little about Frances. She was one of the first female, she graduated from Yale. She was one of the first women that went to Yale. Her great-great-uncle was Noah Webster, who wrote the Webster's Dictionary. And she had spent 2 years in Europe as a teenager, traveling around, primary focus, arts and crafts movement of William Morris and Ruskin. She became enamored with the thought that with the Industrial Revolution, we were losing something. And she had a fine sense of art. She knew what was what. She'd been in all the great museums. And when she got back, she saw that what her future looked like was this. She could be a teacher or she could be a nurse. And then a third thing came in, and that was social activist. And so she decided to come here. And she decided it was a little too tame. She wanted adventure. We think, well, these rich, educated women, they had it made. Not so. It was even more stifling for a woman of means with education. You weren't allowed to get out in your knickers and work in the garden. You had to ride side saddle. You had to have on a bustle. Or you had to have everything clenched in a big fancy dress all day long. And that freedom is what she craved. And the thing about Miss Goodrich that I noticed from studying her is that she had a singular ability to move in any circle. She was not a judgmental person from what I've noticed. And she could come into a community, take her time, study the social niceties, and become accepted. Almost impossible at that time. Many missionaries had come to this area, absolutely spurned. Completely spurned. Get out in the hollers. I don't know what you're preaching, but it's not what I'm listening to. And a lot of them had this elitist attitude that their religion was better than the religion that was happening out in the country. And that was probably the thing that set them off. But not Miss Goodrich. So she decides she's going to hook up with the Presbyterian Home Mission and in Madison County, what they called Bloody Madison then. And it was bloody. There was a lot of well, let's just say it was wild and woolly. And so she came out, and her only way she could travel, she had 7 communities that she went to, and the only way she could travel was by pony. She had a pony named Cherokee. I'm not making this up. It sounds like I am, but I'm not. And she started what you call little groups of women, because that's what she saw when she got here. She saw women just didn't have any way to get together and talk or anything. So she started these little groups of women, and she became so well loved that they named her the Bishop of the Laurel, up in Shelton Laurel, Sodom Laurel, Laurel, and she started little hospitals, little satellite schools, and she'd ride her pony around with a guard. She wasn't alone, let's get that in her mind, there was a guard. And because of that, a family in the community of Britton Cove had a 40-year-old handmade coverlet heirloom that they had saved. This is such a gift, it's almost hard to imagine anybody giving this heirloom to a stranger. They handed that to her. Thank you for what you've done for our community. We couldn't be more thankful than to hand you this gift. And she was so touched. Not only was she touched that she had been given that gift, when she saw the craftsmanship and the beauty of this coverlet done in the double bow knot pattern, which is something that hadn't been seen. A lot of these patterns that had been kept in the mountains were ones that had long ago been forgotten. She said, who made this, and where can I find more of them? I could sell these. All my friends in New York, all my friends over would love to buy these. And so they found a woman who was still making them. And this was also dyed with chestnut bark. We've got to remember that the chestnut tree had died a terrible death here. But this coverlet was dyed with chestnut bark, so that made it even more special. So Miss Goodrich, it's like a light bulb went off in her head. Wait a minute, this coverlet. I know people would buy this. It's such good quality, because see, I know quality. I know the difference. And if I can find a way to teach women in this community how to make these, I can sell them, and they'll have money. And when women have their own money, lots of things happen. Changes come. But she had to be careful, because you don't want to alarm the boys. But she had the ability to soothe and work that angle. So she bought looms, and she found a woman who had these old drafts in the trunk. I mean, it sounds unreal, it's true. And she got the drafts, and she found out how to make it. She got everything, and she got these women cranked up. And when they first got their money in, it went out all over. I don't know how, it wasn't the internet then, but somehow the word got around. And the next week, there was a line of women ready to make some money. You know, this was the difference between having teeth or not. I mean, this is the difference between being comfortable and scratching out a living. So she's the first person that had this idea. And then over here is a thing called the Southern Mountain Workers. And it sounds communist, doesn't it, kind of? Socialist form. And that was a group, a lot of them were idealists, many of them were women, Ivy League women, who had come down here to do much the same thing. And they had Miss Goodrich, she had already set up this template of what could happen. And so that's how the guild started, basically. And when they heard about this, because it's funny how information travels. It's not like you could just get on there and post it. You know, it's like, oh, there's this woman down in North Carolina. She's got this whole new thing going on. And we could maybe do this here with our community, or even start a school. And so when they went to the Southern Mountain Workers, you know, things happen just like here. The people that come here today, you might meet somebody here, the idea starts, and then something happens. You know, that's how things happen. And so at the Southern Mountain Workers, here's these other women, and I'm going to talk about some of these too. First, I'm going to talk about some of the people that weren't these women I'm talking about, such as Berea College. They were at the first founding meeting, and they were Presbyterian based. And I'll also talk about Mary Martin Sloop, the Dr. Sloop up in Crossnore, another Presbyterian based thing. She and her husband started a hospital, the Crossnore School, which still it continues today, and the weaving room, because she heard about the whole weaving thing, and she got on that track too. And just as an aside, my family partly is from Crossnore, and we knew the Sloops. My grandparents were friends with the Sloops, and never did you hear a word of negativity about these people. It's hard to imagine, but it's true. The Sloops were seen as someone who'd come in and really made a difference. Okay, so she's there at that first meeting. Frances Goodrich is there. Berea College is there. Good old Alan Eaton. And you can't, I mean, I've got to say a little bit about Alan Eaton. When you look through we have a lot of his writings in the Guild archives. Our archivist is here, my clash. And one of the things that I noticed was each year in his Christmas cards, he would say, "This was the best year ever." It didn't matter what year it was. 1951, best year ever. Not whatever, 10 years later, best year ever. I mean, here is an optimist. This is an optimist. This is a man who's an optimist. And so we've got Miss Sloop, and then we've got, what I want to say, like the kind of rebel women that come in here. And they're not really easy to get along with in certain, from what I'm reading. And that's when you bring up Wilmer Stone Viner, okay, and her name herself, because she's a natural dyer, and I do natural dyeing, and there's a reputation for natural dyers to be grouches, or just like snap your head off. Her nickname is PDQ. You got something? No. And so here's Wilmer, and she's got a chip on her shoulder from a young age. At six years old, she's orphaned, okay, with nobody, no brothers and sisters. And she is taken in by distant relatives on a plantation in New Orleans, and she goes to live there. And she is given every educational opportunity, and she goes to Vassar. But she's still got the chip. And in an interview with Edward Dupuy, she says, "All I wanted as a child was my own home. All I wanted is not be beholden to anyone. And I'll take a home in a shack before I'll be in this position I was growing up." You know, she was very blunt with what she said. So she goes to Vassar, and through Vassar, and we see this with these Ivy League schools, there's some connection with the Pine Mountain Settlement School in Harlan, Kentucky. These are the coal fields. And that made Madison County look like Fifth Avenue, okay? I mean, it was rough up in there. I mean, rougher than you can even imagine. And for a woman, 22-year-old women at the Pine Mountain Settlement School, these gals were brave. So Wilmer, I'm calling her Wilmer, although I obviously didn't know her. I feel like I did. She says, I'm going to Harlan, Kentucky, and I'm gonna have something different in my life. So she goes there and she becomes a house mother for 14 young boys from broken low-income homes that have nowhere else to go. And it was the time of her life. Those boys loved her, and she loved it. It was her first real home of her own. And it's hard to imagine the joy that you can hear just in what you read from Wilmer Stone Viner, and that freedom, riding a horse on her own, wearing whatever she wanted to, and just being her own person. But then came wintertime, and here she's got these 14 boys and no clothes, nothing hardly to clothe them. And so she says, how can I clothe these boys? It's freezing. And she talks to somebody in the community. She says, we've got sheep farmers here that will give you raw wool if you can find a way to make it into clothes, mittens, socks, sweaters, hats. And so she did. She taught herself. She learned how to spin and weave so that she could make these, or knit. Well, she sent them off to her friends, which she made yarn, and they would knit these things and send them back. Well, here's the only problem. Can anybody guess what the only problem was with the raw wool? It was white. It's white, and you've got boys all under the age of 15. Here's the boy mom with a bunch of nasty looking clothes. You know, she's got, and so she said, I've got to somehow dye these clothes to where these boys aren't walking around with coal all over them looking bedraggled. And so she went in the community and asked if anybody knew how to dye clothing. And she found an old lady, Aunt Sarah, somebody, who says, yeah, there's lots of things in the woods. There's walnut, you know, we can use lots of things make yellow, let me just tell you. Just go out in the woods, pick lots of things, you can make a yellow dye. And that's what they did, and that's how she taught herself to become a natural dye, which they call vegetable dyeing then. And so she sent to the Library of Congress. She got every bit of writing that she could find on it. She wrote down the recipes of the local women, and in it she wrote a book that she dedicated to her mentor, which was a suffragette named Catherine Petit. So Wilmer had set her course, and with that natural dyeing and her ability to spin and weave, she decided she wanted to come to Saluda because she had summered there with her distant relatives and start a store. And and she wanted to find it sounds to me like she was ready to find a man that she wasn't gonna have to, work too hard. And she did. She found an English, well, he wasn't an earl, but he was kind of an earl. He was a rich British guy. Let's just put that. And so she got married to him, and she got this beautiful rock house full of antiques. She got the house she'd always wanted, and I'm glad for her. I am. So there's Wilmer. She's your rebel. And of course we've got Miss Goodrich, and then we've got to talk about Penland School, and that's Lucy Morgan. And she was the only native in those founding members of the guild. Her brother was Episcopalian, and they had started a mission up in where I'm from, which is Mitchell County. And so she went there, and she too went to the Southern Mountain Workers, and that's where she found out about this great spinning and weaving gig. And that's how Penland School started. And then they left from just the weaving to become Penland School. And so each of these women have written books. If you want to study more about it, Frances Goodrich, Mountain Homespun, Lucy Morgan, Gifts of the Hills, Miss Sloop, hers is Miracle in the Hills. They're really interesting. Wilmer has her dye book, which it has a lot of they don't change. The plants don't change, so the dyes don't change. It's still just as current today as it was when she wrote it. And okay, so you get this in your mind of these women who decided to take a different path, and not always easy, and that people viewed them with suspicion. If you've ever seen the movie Songcatcher, has anybody ever seen that movie? I think a lot of that movie was basically based on women who started the guild. I know it had a lot to do with John C. Campbell, which I'm going to talk about here, and just the absolute suspicion of these highfalutin, educated women are going to come in here and change things for the worse. But it ended up that they didn't. They changed it for the better, and that's the amazing thing. And so we'll talk about John C. Campbell Folk School, and when I read through, I've read some things that say that the woman who started John C. Campbell, Olive Dame Campbell, is the person who had the idea for the guild. When her husband came down here, he was working for Russell Sage Foundation, and he went out and met people. He was on a horse, just go up in the holler and meet one, and then he would report back. These people are really smart. They're just isolated. It's not like they're some kind of subhuman, which is what people kind of thought back then, like for people in other continents. And so he worked to save the culture. That was one of the things that was his push here, and she was along with it. So they got this idea of having a school, and so the schools that were folk schools were in Denmark. And so Olive Dame Campbell and Marguerite Bidstrup went to Denmark in the 1920s to just see what was happening over there and see if they could come bring that to North Carolina. And so there's this story that Marguerite Bidstrup told that I read, where it says, we were walking along a river in Denmark, we'd been looking at these schools, and all of a sudden she said, Olive turned to me and she said, what we need is a guild. We need to draw in all these people that are doing the same thing and make it stronger by having one organization like an umbrella over all these people that are kind of doing the same thing. And if we come together, we're twice as strong, which is true. So that the credit for the person who had the idea evidently was Olive Dame Campbell. And so down at Browstown, has anybody here taken a class there? I have. Oh yeah, isn't it great?
Lots of classes.
Lots of classes. So you know what I'm talking about, the magic of that school.
Yeah.
And when you walk into the Keith house and you get that smell of that old wood, and it's just like you're transported to another place. And you've got this week maybe to just create. No pressure, good food, you know, and it takes you out of your regular life and into something different. And so Olive Dane Campbell, she's the person who started that school. And she is one of the founding members of the Guild. And she also worked with gathering songs, ballads. And I noticed when I looked at the ballad collection for this whole area, that they went to places that mainly our guild members, our founders, had kind of set up. They've got a lot of Madison County, they've got a lot down there on the edge of Georgia, and there's other places that are not represented with ballads, even though they had ballad singers. And so I think that was the same network for craft and music, with those same people that kind of work together to preserve. Not only preserve, but perpetuate. You know, not just kind of keep it in a dead status, but to take it further and out. And so they were forward thinking in that way, that group. And now I've got two people I'm going to talk mostly about. And it's not that they're my favorites, but it is that they're my favorites. Because now, there's two people that really have had a lot to do with the Guild and have had not near as much attention, primarily because they were not linked up with a school. When you're linked up with a school like that, you've just basically got your old home place. You know, everybody comes in, there's a picture of grandma, you know the whole story. Now, if you're not connected with a school, you don't have any heirs because you are an independent woman that just decided, you know, I'm just not into that whole thing. I just want to do my own thing. And, you know, I don't really want kids or whatever. And so, and then you didn't write a book because you're too busy working to write a book, maybe. Then you're forgotten. Well, see, that's why I want to today. I'm going to talk about these two people that really, I think Clementine Douglas was the heart of the Guild, you know. And during the pandemic, which everybody knows we've all been affected by that in some way. I don't know anybody had a great experience during the pandemic. But this was one thing that really did change my life during the pandemic, was, you know, we weren't supposed to come in and work, but I just could not come in. I had to come in. You know, you just had to come in, you know. You're used to going in there, you gotta go to work. And there wasn't anything really to do, but so I'm gonna go in the archives and see if there's anything in there of interest. And we've got an amazing archive at the Southern Highland Craft Guild. I mean, amazing. And I looked and there was this whole stack, this whole wall full of Clementine Douglas's correspondence. And I thought, wonder if anybody's ever read her stuff. Wonder if anybody's done this, you know. I think I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna read all of her letters. I decided I was going to. And then I saw there was Louise Pittman's director's files. And this is the other one I'm talking about, is Louise Pittman. And there was correspondence in there as well. And I thought, okay, I don't know how long this pandemic's gonna last, but what I'm gonna do is read what these ladies wrote. Well, it wasn't as easy as you might think, because Clementine's handwriting looked like some kind of spider. I mean, it was spidery. Because, you know, this is in this 19, I think her diary starts about 1920 or something. But a lot of the letters were to her mother, you know, but let me tell you about Clementine. Okay, so she too was born into privilege, but she had a terrible incident as a child, which has not been actually, it's either she caught something or she fell. She had a terrible spine injury that caused her pain the rest of her life. And then her back was curved. And back then, you know, all you could do was give you laudanum or morphine. There wasn't like something you could do to help a person who had a spinal curvature. And so she had private tutors. And when they would bring in and read these adventure books, it was just like she would dream of getting out of this smothering environment and having adventures. And so when it came time to go to college, and she'd had her tour of Europe too, she knew what was art and what wasn't. She'd been to she decided to go to New York City to go to the Pratt Institute. She was one of the first women that ever went there. Design. She was interested in art design. And they allowed her to go. As long as there was family up there, and she had to be with her family. She wasn't allowed to do a lot of different things. And the excitement, you can almost, it just comes off the page when she writes about her escape to New York City. And when she got out of there, she taught at a private school. She did some things, but then she went to a meeting which was organized by the Southern Mountain Workers. And it was a woman named Helen Dingman from Berea College, and she was asking for volunteers to go to Harlan, Kentucky, down to Pine Mountain Settlement School. Who here wants to go down here and live in the wilderness and ride a pony through the woods and not have all the comforts that you've had, and it might be dangerous, and you might, all these things might happen. And Clementine's like, take me, I'm going. You know, she's ready to go. And she did. And here she is with this deformity. She had a hump on her back at 20-something years old in pain. And she's on her pony named Preacher. This is 20 years after Miss Goodrich. But if it had been 20 years before, Clementine would have been the star. But it seemed like, as I read through all these letters, every single time she was a day late and $1 short for being famous. So Clementine goes to Pine Mountain Settlement School. And there's Wilmer Stone Viner at the same time. She's there. And they become friends, only to become enemies later, as we see in the letters. And, you know, Clem and Francis also had a run-in later on. We'll talk about that. But anyway, all that's in the letters. But we're reading through there when she's at Pine Mountain, and I'm just going along, spider, my unbornness, about, this, and we did this, mother, blah, blah, blah. And then there's Clem when a child drowns, one of the students drowns, and she is unable to save the child because she is unable to jump in and save. And the absolute heartbreak that she felt. And when I read that, that's when it clued into me. This like, wow, this is a person who's different. You know, this is a whole letter about how upset she was that she couldn't save this child. And I thought, here's somebody with, you know, I'm gonna read through all this. And that's what hooked me, was when that happened to that child. And she learned how to do natural dyeing. She learned how to do spinning. She learned how to do weaving. And Wilmer said, I'm in Saluda, come visit me and see what I've got and look at the area, and you might want to settle here. So that's what Clementine did. She came to Asheville, and she came to Beaver Dam. That was her first area that she came to. And then she bought land on Hendersonville Highway and started the spinning wheel. Have y'all been down Hendersonville Highway? Yeah. Like you're going to, and you look on the left, there's a little cabin there called Clem's Cabin. It's worth a trip. It's on the National Historic Register. It was designed by William Dodge, who's a famous architect of Asheville. He's called the Asheville architect. Kind of like the look of Asheville that we think of, old Asheville. That's William Dodge, a lot of it. And Clementine, her whole house, she had her house built by him and her business. And it still stands. And that's kind of cool. That's Clementine's, what she did. Okay, so, and then there's Louise Pittman. Okay, she came down to John C. Campbell Folk School. She was there when they had the founding meeting, but she didn't go because somebody had to stay and mind the store. She had to be there to take care of the school. And see, so she is not included as a founder, even though she was there from all the meetings, because she wasn't at that first meeting. Okay, well, get this. Frances Goodrich wasn't at that first meeting either. She was 88 years old or whatever, and she couldn't make the ride from Asheville to Spruce Pine on an old track.
In the snow.
In the snow. So, but yet doesn't matter that she wasn't there, but now Louise has never been included. But Louise Pittman was there from 1930 to the Guild, all the way. She was director from 1951, 1961, up until her death in 1972. Louise Pittman was right there in all of the Guild decisions. She started the Tennessee Guild, and that merged with the Southern Highland Craft Guild in the 40s. And Louise and Clementine were best friends. Those two were best friends. And Louise doesn't have a book, and she doesn't have kids, and she doesn't have a school, and nobody knows anything about her. And that's why I want to talk about her too, but both of them. And the thing that's really interesting about Clementine is she was there from the 30s until her death in 1966. On the board several times, president of the board many times. And you got to think, like back in the 30s, they only had like 12 members of the guild. You know, it wasn't like there was stretched out. They had the region of nine states, but there wasn't a whole lot of, say, mass membership. That happened over the years. And there wasn't a director until 1944, and that's when the guild was going to apply for a Rockefeller grant, and they had to have a director. And that was Marion Hurd, which she needs to be mentioned too. She was a longtime director at Aramont School, and Aramont was one of our founding members. And she wrote the curriculum for the University of Tennessee's craft program and design program. And she was big with starting the craft fair of Southern Highlands, or was known as the Craftsman's Fair. So Marion Hurd needs to be mentioned as well in that first generation. But so here we are with Clementine. She's got her spinning wheel. And as I read through those letters, I read, her and Frances were in competition. Okay, you've got Allen Stand, which is the nation's oldest craft shop. I don't know if I mentioned that. That's what she started up there in Madison County. And it was, I kind of went in a round circle to get to that, but it was an old, what they call a drover's road. So if you had turkeys or whatever you wanted to take to Asheville to make money, you had to, get out with your whip, crack them down the old road to Asheville, which was like a 2 or 3 day trip. It wasn't like, just on the interstate. And so there was an old shack there at Allen's called Allen's Old Stand. And that's what people would call it. Oh, Allen's Old Stand, which turned into Allen's Stand. And so she put things in that shack, coverlets, baskets, and that became the nation's first craft shop. Now, if you want to see the nation's first craft shop, you can still do that over at the Folk Arts Center, the whole lower part. It still lives. And that, you think, Frances, she gave her shop to the guild. And it wasn't like something that she had decided easily. She wanted a group that was going to maintain her ideals, and that was to help people. That was what Frances Goodrich was about. Yeah, she liked to make money, but she had her own money. And Frances Goodrich was so revered that from looking at her funeral write-up, they basically pretty much stopped traffic in Asheville for her. It was that kind of funeral. And she made a huge impact. And so you think back, well, what would the guild have been like if it hadn't been for that gift? And, my feeling is it would have been a bunch of people sitting around with ideas, because there wasn't, that income changed it from being idealist to something concrete. And it was the first 18 years of the guild was focused on Allen Stand and then that Rockefeller grant until 1948 for what they called the Craftsman's Fair back then. And then when the Women's Lib came in, it was like, wait a minute, there's women here too. We're not gonna call it Craftsman's Fair. Although Gatlinburg did take the name of our fair, and they still have the Craftsman's Fair. Uncool. Uncool. And they also took the dates. And that's one thing to remember. I'm off subject just slightly, but when we left Gatlinburg, and there's all kinds of stories that swirl about that we were run out of Gatlinburg because we made too much money. When we left Gatlinburg, went to Knoxville for 2 dismal years, Gatlinburg Chamber of Commerce moved in on our dates, kept our name, and acted like we hadn't left. Uncool. But if we ever leave again somewhere, better buy the dates next time. And keep sure about that name. But anyway, so until 1948, the Allen Stand was the show for the guild, for these people. And what happened was they all kind of branched out on their own thing. They had their own gig. Aramont became Aramont. Campbell became Campbell. Penland became Penland. Berea.
Wilmer was happy down there in a rock house with, she didn't care. She didn't come back really, except sometimes she did come back and teach a dyeing workshop, only to insult several people while she was there, I think. And, but then who's holding the fort is Clementine and Louise. They're there through the whole, till their death. And I think, from what I read, that because we didn't really hit nonprofit status until the 50s. We applied, they wouldn't give it. We applied, they wouldn't give it. Why? Because they didn't think that teaching people how to sell their work was education. But it is. It is education. If you want to make a living doing something, you have to know how to find a market, and the Guild could find a market for you to a certain extent, but you're on your own, really. And so finally they convinced North Carolina nonprofit, whatever, segment, that the Guild was a nonprofit. During that time, the Guild hit really hard times. The fair didn't make money at first. It lost money. $2,000 lost in 1948 is a huge amount of money. It doesn't seem like that much now, but it was. And so I think Clementine floated the Guild with her own money. I mean, my feeling from reading that was there's things that could have gone without her coming in with her own money. So in 1951, she became president of the board, and Louise Pittman became director of the Guild. And here we see something amazing. When you've got two people that see the same vision for an organization working together, big things happen. And there was a big increase in the membership. Louise Pittman was a get out and talk to people person. People did not, when she would get out, because most of the people that were members were country people at that time. And they, like when we had our first fair in Gatlinburg, most of those people had never been out of their own hometown. And so there was a lot to do to make sure there was housing. These were people that you were so excited they were coming into town that people were going to get to see a real mountaineer. Well, Louise Pittman had this plain speaking way about her, and she looked plain, and she looked like a farm wife. And she would go out, she went and talked to every Guild member in their homes, and they trusted her. And she said, we're going to be making some changes, and I want you to know what they are. Because the Guild was like, like Christmas to people who had no other way to make money. And they took it seriously. Like when I first started working at the Guild in 1993, what we had at the craft fair was called the Open Forum. And all the members were invited first thing in the morning to come and just state what they had to say. And it was mostly mountaineers back then. And buddy, they'd say it. And then they'd get it out, and then they'd go in the break room and eat together. Just get it out and say, I don't agree with that. I don't want that. This is my Guild. I don't want that. And that was the thing that was Louise Pittman. She wanted to know what everybody thought, and she listened. She was a listener. And so it was kind of the glory days in a way, a certain type of glory for the Guild, because Frances and all these, and I'm calling her by her first name. I hope you don't mind, Frances, but they knew quality, and that's the thing that started the Guild to begin with. Nobody got in that didn't know, because they knew, they'd been in those great museums. They knew the difference between shoddy workmanship, and so you weren't allowed in. And see, the world was different here then. I grew up around here, and my dad worked for the Wildlife Resource Commission. And before everything turned into these game lands, a lot of that was old farms. And I would go with him to go see these old people. He had a yearly travel that he would go and check on these old timers at their farms. And he called me Punk. Punk, I want you to walk around the fence lines and see what's going on, because they're old, they don't know what's going on, their families all moved around. I want you to check, see if there's holes in the fence lines, whatever. And so I would leave and he would visit. Sometimes he would help them get things done. They had the most amazing handmade things in their house. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was so simple in a way, but it was just, it touched me. I mean, it did. A fiddle on the wall, or, everything was handmade practically. There might be only 4 plates, but they would be handmade. It was just, to me, a whole different life. And so when I came to the Guild, when I saw that handmade, when I came to the Folk Art Center for the first time, it felt like home. Something about it clicked with me. It's like, they're about handmade stuff too. These are the same people I remember as a kid. This is the same kind of aesthetic. Okay, so that's kind of my background on why I'm even interested in all this stuff. So here in the 50s, that's still going on. Things after World War II, things changed, but not as quick as they may have in the cities. And Louise Pittman, in her plain speaking, she was trusted. She was trusted by the members. And Clementine was loved. She had found her home. She was loved. And so from 1951 to 1961, this is the glory days of Louise and Clementine, where they really made it happen. The fair was booming. Well, not booming, but it wasn't losing $2,000 a show. And they were right there working themselves to the bone and loving every second of it. Okay, and when things changed, and I'll tell you exactly the moment they changed, was Lyndon B. Johnson's inaugural address when he became president, and he declared war on poverty in Appalachia. And when he declared war on poverty in Appalachia, big money came, the Appalachian Regional Commission. And when big money comes, you just follow it in politics if you have that kind of mind. When big money is put in a certain place, things happen in that place. And so when big money came into Appalachia, there's some good that happened, Head Start, there's lots of programs, but there's also some things that happened that there was a lot of co-opting. So the culture became popular. Here's people all these politicians wanting a handmade mountain dulcimer. Things like that like dulcimer makers became rock stars in a way. Big money and lots of attention. And I'm going to talk about the next generation of the Guild only because Clementine and Louise were still there. They set this up. But when that happened in 1964, the director was Bob Gray. No, he wasn't a woman. He was a hard-nosed businessman and an ex-Marine. And I knew him quite well. And here's another woman who is taking us into the modern era, and that's Persis Grayson. Well, Persis Grayson followed the same trajectory as our founding members in a lot of ways. She went to Miss Porter's school. Her mentor was Clementine Douglas. And she had a lot of friends in Washington that were wives of elected officials. So you bring in Bob Gray, who was like, think about a dog who's a schnauzer, He's like, Harsha! And Persis has the manners of, Persis was lovely. You knew Persis, right? Catherine, you remember Persis? Pamela? I loved her. You know, Tara, you knew Persis. And she
was a weaver.
Spinner.
And did she do dyeing too?
I don't know if she did.
She did dyeing.
Yeah. Did she do
dyeing and spinning and weaving?
The Persis and Bob Gray she was president of the board and Bob Gray was the director, and they neither couple, they did their holidays together, the two couples. They didn't have kids. They went on vacations together. The Guild was their absolute life for 6 years. And her connections in Washington and Bob Gray's schnauzer qualities, and I'm going to tell you he was, they snatched every dollar available for the Guild. Now, he was a family man who only cared about his own family. I'll tell you, but that's fine if that's your family. And she could grease the wheels on anything. She did the same thing Louise did. She went out and talked to every member in their home. She said, there's changes coming because of the Folk Art Center. There's this dream of the Folk Art Center and what that's going to do for the Guild and for the region. And that was what they were laying the groundwork for, was raising money for the Folk Art Center. And it actually happened in 1980. You can go out there and see the dreams. And that dream had gone back all the way to the founders. First dream, the fair. Second dream, a center, a home for us, our own home. It's like when I have school groups come in or I'll tell them, it's like, this is the grandma's attic. You look around through here, all these people that have been a big part of our organization, there's something of them here, either in the archives, the library. A lot of the books in the library, they were donated by our founding members. So it's that continuity, that combination of family, and it's also that single-minded focus of working together, finding something and then working together. And I think, well, I've talked about Clementine, I've talked about Louise, and I've vaguely talked about this in the 60s, and then further in. Every time that, with any organization, when you find that base of a focus and working together and being able to take your personality out of it. Because you think about our founding women, all of them had strong personalities, and they're all used to being in charge. And like with craftspeople or people who have their own business, you're used to being in charge. You know, that's part of the allure of it. You know, you don't have a boss, you don't have a time clock. And when you're used to having that at your own momentum, it might be hard to get in a group and you know, play nice. Yeah. But even though Clementine and Frances had that competition in those letters, you know, her thing was, Frances has a way of bringing people together. She has a way of making the differences smooth into a group that works together. And that's an art or a craft. So I have to say, I admire these women. I mean, I really do. And the more I read, the more I admired them. And in Louise Pittman's directors, and like I read Bob Gray's directors things after that, because I was like, well, what? All this was in Miss Pittman's. What's going to be in Mr. Gray's? He cleaned that out. He didn't want you knowing what went down. I mean, but her letters were like personal, you know, like, oh, well, when I got back from Gatlinburg today, you know, my cat, I don't know what that was about, but it made me think of you. And then I thought about you. I thought about that good work you were doing with this. And I know exactly where we can take that. You know, those were her chatty kind of director's letters. And that was, at that time, that's what was needed. I don't know that that would be needed right now. But I know that at the time, she was exactly what the organization needed. And it hurts me that she's been forgotten. And it hurts me that Clementine hasn't received what she ought to receive. Because not only was she amazing, but she did it as a handicapped person. You know, even there she refused to take pain-killing medicine. It makes me dull. I can't think clearly when I take that. I would rather be in pain than sit here and be dull. I want to be lively, you know. And she had people to her house, you know. It was very, it was almost like watching an Agatha Christie thing, you know, where they're having, you know, sherry in the dining room, you know. It was that kind of life. But it was also, it was not easy. It was not easy for her. It really wasn't. Or Louise either, because they just kind of went their own way. And it wasn't popular to be a single woman, and a bossy single woman. And then when you read through Louise's, and this is something that made me absolutely livid, when I read through all these letters that she'd kept, and they called her the executive secretary. Ooh. Not one of them said executive director, even though she was for 10 years. Not one of them called her the director. And she just went ahead and dealt with it anyway. You know, she didn't let that bother her. And when she would come to the fair, even after she left, people would come just to talk to her. She had that kind of personality. And this is just between us, even though this is guild gossip. I think Mr. Gray was very jealous of Louise. And I think he did a lot of what she did, because he didn't want people to know that Louise had a lot to do with things. So, are there any questions about this little fireside chat? You ever just questions? Anything I can? Yeah.
Just curious. We've volunteered at the fair quite a few times, but the folk art center is fantastic. But that section upstairs is amazing. There's like 3 sections.
Yeah.
Now, is that a permanent exhibit? Are there archives that they change the?
You talk about the permanent collection that's right by the library?
Yes.
That's from our permanent collection. And we have hopes of sometime having a museum, because we have like 5,000 objects in our permanent collection that aren't being able to be seen because we don't have any room.
Oh.
And then related to that, a couple of years ago, there was a big controversy of renewing the contract. And how was that settled, and what's the future?
Would somebody like to speak to that?
Repeat the question?
He's talking about the park service, working, but this is the president of the board and our vice president of our board. Here's our
A man.
archivist and our former curator and another board member and another guild member. Yep.
I will say real quick, our executive director, Tom Bailey, and I, met with the Park Service the other day, and we got a new superintendent. We're coming up on a new 10-year agreement, but we are right now in a 1-year extension because of the pandemic kind of put everything behind. But we're pretty confident real confident in it. Tom's super confident in, a new contract. We don't feel like there's anybody out there that can compete with us, but we do have to fill out a 150, 200 page prospectus to renew that contract. It's a big deal. But Tom's really on it.
And isn't it true that, the Folk Art Center was built with guild money, not with Park Service money? I mean, the Folk Art Center was built with guild money.
Yeah.
Raised money that was raised.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing that we lease it or rent it from them. Now we're under a new agreement, a concessions agreement, which sometimes I forget exactly what that means, and it's part of the display space upstairs where some of those exhibitions are. They have to be items that are for sale. That was part of the new agreement from the Park Service. So sometimes they slip new things in on us, but we do feel like we do have a good relationship with them. I'm not 100% sure of your question, to be
About the
honest.
guild money? That's true. It absolutely is true.
The guild raised the money to build the Folk Art Center, but it was built on Parkway property,
Mhm.
so it is owned
It's
by.
not their building, really. I mean,
Right, so
in the
they
sense of
actually
ownership.
own it. And then for the first few decades, we had a, collaborative agreement, right? Where basically every 10 years, they'd shake hands, the director would shake hands with the director of the National
For
Park
30
Service.
years. 30 years.
Right, 3 decades.
Yeah.
And it was pretty much a cooperative agreement. You all keep doing what you're doing, and we're good with it. Then when it turned to a concession agreement, they started taking a percentage of sales from the shop. And that's why they started demanding that what had been, just like an educational exhibition space, needed to have things for sale in that. They forced us to break up part of that space to have even more retail, because they were taking a percentage. And so in part of these agreements that we have to do every 10 years now, it's always like, well, now we want 10%. Or, you're never quite sure what they're gonna ask for, but, yeah. So it's a really kind of weird little setup there of the way things work and the way things have changed. The Park Service, the national government is giving them less money, right? Where are we gonna get money? How are we gonna pay for this? The Folk Art Center is the most visited spot on the Blue Ridge Parkway. And they also own the Moses Cone building, which is our gallery up in Blowing Rock on the Parkway, which was the first agreement we made with the Park Service before the Blue Ridge Parkway was even built. They made an agreement that we would have a retail shop to help people understand the history of the region and the things that were being made. Sorry.
So I'll quit something to say in that question. So, in listening to you, a lot of the challenges I think they faced then, found in the Guild, we still face now in some ways. But I wonder if they would be proud of us.
I do.
Yeah.
I think they would be proud. And I will say, Jason's getting ready to be off the board. He's served 6 years, but I think history will be kind to him because he was the board president during the pandemic, and he helped calm people, and we got through it. And with our executive director as well, who has an amazing financial acumen that has put us in a place to where we aren't Well, and that's the thing, when you become a nonprofit and you are at the mercy of grants, the government pretty much tells you the direction you're gonna go. But we have been singularly able to not have to do that over the years, and that's some of the things that they all wanted, the founding members, was to be independent. And so we don't have grants from the government. Very rarely do we even apply because we make our own way. And that can make you kind of isolated from other arts organizations. But when you look at the Folk Arts Center and you look at what we're doing even now, you know, we're still holding the course. They would be proud, I know they would. Francis told me that. Been a dream.
Janet, what would you say is the most concrete way that people can show their support of the Guild?
Well, come to the craft fair, come to the Folk Arts Center, just be a part of it. And we need volunteers. Thank you for volunteering at the fair. And if you're a craftsperson, jury into the Guild. We'd love to have new members.
So I just became a new member just
Yay!
last month. So any advice or direction or just in general,
Get involved.
Okay.
And back here, we've got our annual meeting chair, another member here.
You just sent me an email today about 5 a day.
Oh, you're Heidi.
Yeah, I'm Heidi.
Okay. So it's great to see so
Yeah.
much.
How many members do you have of the craft guild?
Well, probably about 750, something like that. And then I know her from National Newcomers. I went and taught fiber art for them and had a great little experience with your
Yes,
group
you did.
right before the pandemic.
That's right.
So,
Thank you.
oh, you have a question?
What is a quick process of how you get into the Guild?
Well, we've got a mentoring workshop coming up, and you go on our website, and if you're interested, the mentoring workshop, what it can do is just,
I don't wanna be part
oh,
of it.
but somebody does.
I mean, just like, what's the quick process of, how do you do it?
Well, you've got a jury in, there's a two-part, you've got a jury in, and it's tough.
Yes.
But that's why the mentoring thing is good, because it can kind of tell you what a body of work is, you know.
As someone who recently went through the whole
Oh,
process,
There we go.
it is, first of all, I couldn't have done it without the mentoring workshop. It made a huge difference, and someone said something that stuck with me. It's like, don't do anything normal. Don't rest on your laurels. Don't send pictures of the things that you always make. Like, be weird, be different. Like, if there's something in the back of your mind that you're like, oh, I've been wanting to make this thing for so long. Now's the time to do it, because that's what sets you apart from everybody else. And that was like my favorite piece of advice. And then there's the first part, which is photographs and quite a lengthy couple long written questions, answers about yourself and, you know, the art you practiced. And then if you pass that part, then you go to a second one. We actually take your physical items to the Folk Arts Center, and we have all the tables set up in the auditorium, and you put your things in your, whatever your art is, and then you submit some more photographs of things that you would possibly sell. And the standards, there's two different ways they judge it. One is standards as far as, you know, is your craft done really well? Is it something that's gonna last? Is it gonna hold up? Is something gonna fall apart in a couple days? And then the other is like, or your artistic vision, like, is this really something that's really amazing and different? You know, does this artist have a clear voice? Is all your work cohesive? So that's the second part. And then, you know, and it's all committees. I mean, it's amazing the way the structure of the Craft Guild is, because all these committees, and it's the members in the committees. I mean, it's quite amazing. And when Tom talked on our Zoom on Wednesday, he even mentioned that they just had a meeting about the craft fair, and they changed the hours because a lot of the artists were, we want to different. We don't want to be there till 6 o'clock, so they changed it to 5.
And you're gonna do the fair?
Maybe, we'll see. I mean, I'm gonna get to a point where I'm ready, but I'd love to do 5 days, so that we'll talk to you all that.
Thank you so much for coming out.
Thank you.
I just want to say, before you go, the library is super excited to be your friend. You're really cool. This is exciting. And thank you to everyone from the Guild, all of you that were able to come today. Thank you. The library is looking forward to hosting a series of programs with some of the craftspeople from the guild, and we have just a couple of spinners and weavers that are gonna be at different libraries in March and April. So we just finalized it yesterday, and there's a bright piece of paper in the back, if you wanna take a picture, it's not online yet, but we have 3 programs in the next 2 months, and then in the fall, we look forward to doing some more programs. So if you are a person here that does a thing, and you're interested in working with the libraries, please talk with me. And thank you so much for coming to the Weaverville Library today.